Our next panel is another fireside chat. The interviewer is Afsaneh Beschloss. She is the CEO and founder of RockCreek, and she will be interviewing David Rubenstein, the co-founder and co-executive chairman of the Carlyle Group. Please welcome them to the stage.
Good morning. Delighted to be here and very interesting to hear from the previous fire chat. I'm especially happy and excited to be here with David, but of course, since David interviews everybody in the world, I have to admit it is kind of nervous-making to be here on the stage with him.
I doubt that.
David, of course, we all know as the founder of really an innovator in private equity, because when he created Carlyle, he made it into a global fund, and one that didn't really exist in the form that he made it. When David then went on to become a philanthropist, it was the same thing. He was an innovator in philanthropy, and he created the brand of patriotic philanthropy and has helped many historical, educational, and art institutions really become a lot more vibrant. As you all know, if you don't, now David is the author of The American Story. If you have not bought this book, I hope that you will go out and buy many copies of it and give it to all your friends for the holidays. But David, in writing this book, what was your biggest surprise? You interviewed a number of historians and Supreme Justices and others. Right. What was the biggest surprise?
Let me describe what it is. I'm on a number of university boards, and I've never written a book, and I felt kind of naked not having written a book with being on a lot of university boards. I said, I have to write a book before I finally die, and so this is my book. What it is this. About 6 years ago, I thought it'd be a good idea to educate members of Congress a little bit more about history, because members of Congress, like many citizens in this country, don't know much about our history and our civics. We don't teach civics very much anymore in high school or junior high school, and history is not taught that much either. For example, 3/4 of Americans in a recent survey could not name the 3 branches of government. 1/3 of Americans could not name even one branch of government. 10% of college graduates think that Judge Judy is a member of the United States Supreme Court, which is not yet the case. And amazingly, if you are any naturalized citizens here, anybody's a naturalized citizen? Okay. If you're a naturalized citizen, you have to spend 5 years in the United States. It used to be 14 years. Then you take a citizenship test, 100 questions. You've got to pass 60 of them. 91% of the people who take that test pass, presumably with some study. The same test was given recently to native-born Americans in all 50 states. And in only one state, Vermont, was the majority of citizens able to pass that test, which says that many people don't really know much about our history and our background and so forth. So as a modest way to begin to do some things in that area, I thought about 6 years ago it'd be a good idea to educate members of Congress a little bit more about history. So I take the great American historians once a month, host a dinner for members of Congress at the Library of Congress. We get about 300 members of Congress coming, and they say that this is among the most enjoyable things they're doing because they get an opportunity to hear from Doris Kearns Goodwin, Robert Caro, David McCullough, John Meacham, and similar people. So that's what the book is about. And I'll just mention one part of it. I interviewed, in addition to that, the Chief Justice of the United States. And he's somebody that members of Congress don't really know, but I knew about his interest in history, and I'll describe that. And so I thought he'd be a good person because they don't really see him that much, and because even though their offices are close together. So I said to him at the beginning of the interview, Mr. Chief Justice, did you always want to be Chief Justice of the United States? And he said, well, no, I didn't want to do that when I was younger. Well, did you want to be a justice at all? No, I didn't want to be a justice. Did you want to be a judge? No. Well, did you want to be a lawyer? No, I didn't want to be a lawyer either. Well, what did you want to be when you were little? I wanted to be a historian. That's all I cared about, American history. And so I just told my father that. My father said, well, there's not much money in being a historian. You write books nobody will ever read. And John said, I don't really care. That's what I want to do. So father said, okay. So went off to Harvard. He majored in history. Came back from his junior year, got off at the Logan Airport in Boston, got into a cab, and said to the cab driver, take me to Cambridge. Oh, the cab driver said, are you a student at Harvard? Yes, I am. What are you majoring in? I'm majoring in history. Cab driver said, well, when I was a student at Harvard, that's what I majored in also. So John thought maybe his father had a good point. Okay.
So you have always been a student of history, and we are now in this unprecedented time when markets are at a big high, and the economy is doing so well. What are the things that worry you right now? What keeps you up, and what are you concerned about a possible recession?
We have recessions every 7 years on average since World War II. And so for the last 3 or 4 years, I'm saying we're probably going to have a recession at some point. Every time I do that, I get in trouble because people say Rubenstein's predicting a recession. So I've decided not to do that anymore and say that eventually, at some point, I cannot predict the economy will go down. I don't know when that will be. When I was in the White House in 1980, President Carter's inflation advisor used to say, I think we're heading into a recession. And Carter, running for re-election, said, look, I'm running for re-election, said the inflation advisor named Fred Kahn, do not use the R word. People get scared when you use it. But Fred Kahn said, I have to be honest. What do you want me to do? He said, just don't use the R word. So from then on, Fred Kahn said, I think we're heading into a banana. And he would use the word banana as a substitute for recession. So I don't know if we're heading into a banana, but I would say that right now it appears that because of lower interest rates, the economy is in reasonable shape, low unemployment. I suspect that we can get through 2020 without a, quote, recession. Now, remember, we might grow at 2% or 1.5%. That's not a recession, not heroic growth. But an economy of our size, growing at 2% is probably, reasonable.
David, do you think we've had too many rate cuts too soon?
Well, time will tell, and like everybody else, I'll have a memo in the file that will say if it went bad, I predicted it, and I'll pull the memo out of the files as everybody else does. As I like to say, people always predict recessions, but they don't tell people that they predicted them until the recession is actually here. Then they get the memos out of the files and say, here's what I actually said. People didn't pay attention at the time, probably. At this point, Jay Powell, who used to be at our firm for about 8 years, a very smart person, is trying to balance many different considerations. Being the chairman of the Fed during an election year is not pleasant because you get lots of people who want to push interest rates lower. The problem with pushing interest rates too low is that if you do get in a recession, the Fed doesn't have a lot of weapons left. The only weapon they'd have left probably would be so-called quantitative easing, which seems to have worked when we used it last time. But I suspect the Fed is, as the chairman of the Fed said, probably pausing for a while. So I think interest rates are low, but I'd be nervous if they went too much lower.
Are you willing to give Jay Powell a grade? As you said, he was at Carlyle. He sat a couple of doors down from you. I remember when I was at Carlyle, I sat on the other side.
A+++, I'd say. No. Look, he was a very talented person who had been in government before. He had the advantage of being a lawyer, which I am trained as well. And he, I think, was a very smart deal person. But he did not believe that private equity was the highest calling of mankind, unlike me, and therefore he decided to leave and do other things in public service. But I don't fault him for leaving the great world of private equity.
So on that point, on the great world of private equity, you've created one of the best, and as I said, I was fortunate, I was your 12th partner there. If you started from scratch today, given all the conversations about ESG, inclusion, sustainable investing, how would Carlyle be different, or how would the next creation by David Rubenstein be different?
Well, people probably forget this, but private equity was a mom and pop business in the 70s and 80s because the partnership agreements forbade you to have more than one fund at a time. So if you had a partnership that you raised, you had to spend 100% of your time managing that partnership, which makes sense. I decided to ignore that a bit and to ask for forgiveness rather than permission. And I asked my partners to run that fund. And then I said, I'm going to try to create a Fidelity or T. Rowe Price of private equity, having multiple funds and then globalizing it, which was novel at the time. Now it's not as novel, but that was what we did that was different. If I was starting all over again, I'd probably be based in Singapore because the greatest growth in the world is going to be in Asia. And I suspect firms based in Asia will probably grow at a faster rate than firms grow based in the West. But I also think that today, private credit, along with private equity, will both boom. And I suspect private credit will probably be a bigger business in time than private equity.
And things like renewable energy, things like health sector, ed tech, technology innovation, are those things that would be a bigger part of future investments?
Yeah, in the early days of private equity, people were not as worried about ESG. In fact, when Mitt Romney ran for the Senate the first time against Ted Kennedy, and then he ran for governor and president, he was criticized for things that Bain had done in the early days. And many of the early day kinds of things that all private equity firms did were really focused on highest rate of return. They weren't worried about job removal to other overseas countries. They weren't worried about environmental protection. They weren't worried about taxes and other things. Today, people are much more concerned about that. They weren't worried about diversity in those days either. So Mitt Romney, when he ran, he was criticized by his political opponents for things that Bain had done in those days, which were normal then, but today wouldn't look good. And so I think today, if I were to start all over, or anybody started today all over, you would be much more worried about ESG factors than you had been then. And at some time, we will have an indicator which indicates that even if you have good IRRs, if your ESG factors aren't that good, you probably won't get money from institutional investors. Today, I'd say you can still get money if your IRRs are high, even if your ESG might not be great, but at some point down the road, that will probably change.
You talked about Singapore and China and Asia. Obviously, today we're starting to hear the news about the trade deal. Is this really a deal, or are we going to not really even be gaining anything in these negotiations that have been very hard? And the Chinese look at things 100 years, not sort of until the next election. So what is your thinking on this short-term success?
I think the president's been told by many people that the overhang of a tension with China is probably not a good thing for the economy in our country and not a good thing for the economy in the year of his reelection effort. Therefore, I think he would like to get something done. And I think while he's not going to get everything done in the first deal, so-called phase one, I think it's better than what we have today. There are three parts to it, the overall deal with China. Number one is China would buy more things from the United States. Number two, they would open up markets in the United States that aren't currently open. And number three, we would have to deal with China 2025. I think the president's recognized that getting something on China 2025 is not likely in the near term. So there'll be a so-called phase one transaction or agreement, which will deal with the parts 1 and 2 that I just mentioned. And I suspect phase 2 will take much more time. It's much more complicated. But I think that will be a relief to the markets. And I think the markets are already beginning to say that they're pleased with something getting done.
Do you think a phase 2 will ever happen? Or are we in a situation where the Chinese economy and the Chinese political system will not allow that?
It's much more challenging because the Chinese government doesn't want to say, well, we want to let the Americans to tell us what we can do in semiconductor design, artificial intelligence, robotics. They want to be able to do what they want to be able to do. And if they want to use government resources, they don't want to be constrained by the United States saying you can't do that. I think it'd be hard to get it done quickly, but I don't know the market is anticipating it. In fact, the whole dispute with China was over trade deficits. It really wasn't over China 2025. And so I suspect the political zeitgeist is such that if you can get some deal in phase 1, that probably will solve, for the near term, the political demands to get something done.
Do you have any plans to interview anyone in China anytime soon?
I will be there in a couple of weeks, I think, and I will be interviewing some people there at a forum, but I don't know that Xi Jinping is going to be waiting for me to interview him. I was the chairman of Tsinghua School of Economics and Management Advisory Board at one point, and I went to the meeting, and they said all of a sudden, all right, we're taking the entire board to meet with Xi Jinping, which I was just new as a chairman, so I wasn't really expecting that. And so I sat down, and I sit there, and all the other prominent people on the board, more prominent than me, were sitting there, and I didn't know what to say to Xi Jinping, so I felt like saying, well, you know, there's an old Chinese proverb that says a trip of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. And I think he said something like, well, that's an American fortune cookie saying. It's not a Chinese saying. So I shrank a little bit and didn't announce any more Chinese sayings, and he didn't tell him about China so much anymore and just listened. But
wonderful. So when you're not doing anything else, you're interviewing the whole world. I don't know if you're willing to say it in this audience, but what has been your favorite interview? Well,
it's like you asking what your children are you like the most. I enjoy interviewing because it gives me a chance to ask questions of people I'm interested in. I interviewed Jeff Bezos, and that was fun. We had about 2,000 people, and I remembered that when he was starting, he first said that he needed a bibliography of books in print. And I reminded him of that. And he came to one of our companies and said that he would give, I think, 25% of a new company he was starting in return for the bibliography of books in print that we would lend him so he could do what he was doing and selling books over the internet. Our people turned it down, and we said we didn't want that from a startup company. We'd take some cash. Eventually, I went out and decided that was a mistake and said, we'll take 20% of your company or so. He thought he didn't need it then to our bibliography so much, but he gave us some stock, and ultimately we sold it at the IPO. So it's today worth about $10 billion, so we gave that up. I think Oprah Winfrey was good. I thought she has a future in television if she wanted it, and told her that.
You haven't interviewed President Trump, to my knowledge.
I have.
Oh, you have? On one of your interviews?
Not on my TV show, but he came to the Economic Club of Washington, and I interviewed him in the green room. This was 5 years ago now. He said, ask me anything you want, but ask me if I'm going to run for president. I said, president of what? He said, president of the United States. I said, you have no chance of being president of the United States. I was wrong. He also asked me if I wanted to pull his hair, because some people think his hair is fake. He said, you can pull my hair. I didn't want to do that, but it's not fake. And anyway, he called me afterwards and said it was a great interview, and he said that it was the highest rated show in the 40-year history of C-SPAN.
Wow. So what would be your question today if you were interviewing him? What would be the question today if you were interviewing the president?
Is being president all that it's cracked up to be? Now that you've been president for 4 years, why do you really want to be president for another 4 years? Is it that attractive to be? And what's the best part of the job, and what's the worst part of the job, and things like that. He's re-engineered the presidency. In the old days, you had press secretaries and you had press conferences, and he's obviously used the tweeting mechanism to overcome that. He's different in many ways, and I would say he has a reasonably good chance of getting reelected despite what's going on in the Congress now.
So you've been involved in presidential campaigns from the very beginning, President Carter, until today in different formats. Right. So what is your prediction on the next election?
If you go back the last 10 presidential elections, a year in advance, and say this person is going to be president, you'll be wrong almost every time. You wouldn't have predicted a year in advance of Barack Obama, Jimmy Carter, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan a year in advance. You certainly wouldn't have predicted Donald Trump. So predicting a year in advance, which is about what it is, a year in advance, is almost always wrong. It's fun, but it's almost always wrong. So I'd say today, you have to know who the president's going to run against. And in the politics, there's an old saying, you can't beat somebody with nobody. So you have to have somebody to, running against that's taken seriously. And right now, it's too early to say, but it looks as if the president will have somebody probably closer to his age group that he's running against than somebody probably very younger.
On that note, I think we're done with our time. Okay. And thank you so much, David.
Thank you.
The 2019 Greenwich Economic Forum is brought to you by Bridgewater Associates. Meaningful work, meaningful relationships. Churchill Asset Management, Nuveen, a leading provider of senior and unitranche debt to middle market companies. Ropes & Gray, bright past, brilliant future. Aurora Capital, inspiring partnerships. And Gramercy Funds Management, we are emerging markets. Special considerations to Bank of America, life's better when we're connected. Noah Private Wealth Management, a leading wealth and asset management service provider in China. Guotai Jinan Futures, a leading brokerage firm for commodity futures and financial futures in China. China Industrial Securities, a comprehensive financial group providing full-spectrum financial services in Hong Kong. And Titan Advisors, built like a hedge fund. Special thanks to the Financial Times and Greenwich Business Institute for hosting us. And thank you to all the sponsors who helped make this event possible. We'll be right back after these messages. Don't go away.